There was a smell to a California morning in the 1930s that nobody thought to write down at the time. Coffee boiling on a gas range, toast going a little too dark, the particular dusty sweetness of orange groves on the edge of town when the summer heat was just starting to climb. You wouldn't have called it beautiful. Most people living it wouldn't have used that word. They were too busy. But there was something happening in California in those years, something complicated and hard and strangely alive that most history books flatten into a single word, hardship. And that word doesn't come close to telling you what it was actually like to be there. Because the 1930s in California were two things at once. They were the worst years many families would ever know, and they were somehow also years that made people. What life was really like in 1930s California. This is not a story about statistics. It's not about numbers on a ledger or facts from a textbook. It's about what the days actually felt like, the weight of them, the texture of them, the quiet dignity of people who had no choice but to keep going, and did. Let's go back to the beginning of that decade. Because to understand California in the 30s, you have to understand what hit America in the fall of 1929. The stock market didn't just fall, it collapsed in a way that rewrote the rules of daily life almost overnight. Banks closed, businesses shuttered, and men who'd worked the same job for 20 years found themselves standing in lines they'd never imagined standing in. Not because they were weak, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because the entire system that held their world together had come apart at the seams. In California, it hit differently than it hit New York or Chicago, because California had always meant possibility. It had always been the place you went when you needed a fresh start. And now the fresh start was gone too. In the early 30s, unemployment in California reached roughly 28%. Think about what that means in human terms. Nearly 3 in 10 men in the state couldn't find work, not because they weren't looking, because the work simply wasn't there. And yet, life continued. Breakfasts were made, children were sent to school with whatever lunch could be packed, neighbors left food on each other's doorsteps without being asked, women stretched a chicken across 3 dinners because they had become masters of making things last. There was a kind of invisible economy running underneath the official one, an economy of favors and reciprocity and community deaths that never got recorded anywhere but kept families alive. The house might have been smaller than the one your parents grew up in. The kitchen might have had bare shelves more often than full ones. But the front door was still open in the evening. The radio was still on. The kids still found ways to turn a tin can into an afternoon's entertainment. That resourcefulness, that refusal to let hardship be the whole story of a life, is the thing that gets lost when we reduce the 1930s to a single image of dust and despair. The people were more than the moment they were living in. They always are.
Then came the Okies. That word, used carelessly, used cruelly by some at the time, doesn't carry what it should carry. Because what arrived on California's highways and back roads in the mid-30s wasn't a problem, it was a people. Families from Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Missouri, people who had farmed the same land for generations and watched it turn to powder, who had packed everything they owned into a Model A or a flatbed truck, mattresses tied to the roof, children sitting on top of them, a dog following behind until it couldn't anymore, and driven west because west was the only direction left. They came by the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates say 3.5 million people migrated to California in the 1930s. 3.5 million people carrying their entire lives in boxes and paper bags, following word-of-mouth rumors about work in the orchards and valleys. What they found when they arrived was not what they'd been told to expect. Some farm owners did hire them, but the wages were so low, sometimes 10 cents an hour, sometimes less, that a family picking crops from sunrise to sunset still couldn't earn enough to eat properly. They lived in roadside camps, makeshift tent cities, some of them with no running water, no sanitation, no shelter from the valley heat that could reach 110 degrees in August. And California, the state that had always been the dream, looked at these families and didn't always know what to do with them. But here is what the records show. Here is what the letters home say and the oral histories confirm and what their grandchildren still carry. They did not break. They planted gardens in the dirt outside their tents. They held church in the open air. They taught their children to read by lantern light. They built community out of nothing, because community was the one thing nobody could take from them. This was how California got made, again, not by the people who already had everything, but by the people who arrived with nothing and refused to leave without something. While those dramas unfolded on the highways and in the tent camps, the Central Valley was doing something remarkable. In the 1930s, the San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys produced an astonishing proportion of the country's food. Oranges, peaches, grapes, cotton, walnuts, lettuce, asparagus. At a time when much of America was rationing and stretching, California's valley floors were producing. The people doing that work, the ones bending in the heat, filling the crates, running the packing lines, were largely invisible to the people eating what they grew. Mexican and Filipino farm workers, many of them in California for decades before the Dust Bowl families arrived, were the backbone of that agricultural machine. They had built the infrastructure, they knew the land, and they worked it through conditions that would stop most people cold. Triple-digit heat, 12-hour days, housing that was barely shelter. Their names aren't in many history books, their photographs aren't in many museums, but the food that kept America fed during its hardest decade passed through their hands, every piece of it. That is a fact worth sitting with for a moment. California's abundance in the 1930s was not an accident of geography. It was the product of human labor, human endurance, and human skill, most of it performed by people who never got the credit they deserved.
Now, let's talk about the other California, the one that existed simultaneously with all of this, a few hours south, a world apart. Hollywood in the 1930s produced something the Depression couldn't touch: escape. At the peak of the decade, 80 million Americans went to the movies every single week in a country of 130 million people. The movie theater became the one place where, for a quarter or less, a family could sit in the cool dark and watch Fred Astaire dance across a marble floor, watch Clark Gable grin like nothing in the world could touch him, watch a world where things worked out. And California was building all of it. The studios, MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, RKO, were operating at full power through the 30s, employing thousands of Californians: seamstresses, carpenters, lighting technicians, makeup artists, writers working in bungalows at dawn, directors who hadn't slept in 36 hours, actors who'd arrived from the Midwest with $15 and a headshot. Hollywood was the Depression's great contradiction. The country was broke, the dream factory was open. And what it was selling, not just to California, but to the whole exhausted world, was the idea that beauty still existed, that joy was still possible, that the story wasn't over. By the late 30s, something was shifting in California's air. The worst of the Depression was loosening its grip, slowly, unevenly, not for everyone at once. The Okies who'd arrived starving were beginning to put down roots. Tent cities were becoming neighborhoods. Children who'd crossed the country in the back of trucks were starting their own families. The Central Valley was finding a rhythm. The studios were producing their greatest films. And in the background, at the edges of the news, a war was beginning to build in Europe and the Pacific that would, within a few years, change everything again. California was about to be asked for something different. It was about to become something different. But that is another story. What life was really like in 1930s California was this. It was hard in ways that are almost impossible to explain to someone who didn't live them, and it was full of human beings making meaning out of circumstances they didn't choose, building something out of what was left, keeping faith with each other when there wasn't much else to keep faith with. The Okie mother hanging laundry outside her tent, watching her children play in the dirt, deciding that this was not going to be the end of her family's story. The Filipino farm worker bending in a field at noon in August, feeding a country that barely knew his name. The usherette in the Hollywood movie palace, guiding strangers to their seats in the dark, helping them forget for 2 hours how heavy everything felt. They all mattered. Every single one of them mattered. And the California they built, in spite of everything, through everything, is still here.